On a freezing winter night, a German shepherd lay shivering in a snowy alley, his ribs visible and his fur matted and falling off. Abandoned and ignored by everyone, his dull eyes held only a flicker of hope that someone might care. But when a kind stranger stopped and saw him, everything changed. What happens next is a story of survival, compassion, and second chances that will warm your heart. The wind howled through the dark streets of Elmsford, carrying with it the bitter chill of winter. Snow blanketed the alleyways, and the world seemed frozen, lifeless. In one such alley, hidden from the view of most passers-by, lay Max, a German shepherd whose once proud frame had wasted away. His ribs protruded sharply, his coat was patchy and filthy, and his eyes were dull, staring blankly at the wall in front of him. He hadn't moved for hours, too weak even to lift his head. Max had not always been this way. Once he had belonged to a family, lived in a warm home, and played in a sunny backyard. His tail had wagged with excitement every time he heard his name. His world had been full of love, safety, and companionship. But all of that had changed when his owners decided they didn't want him anymore. They had moved away, leaving him behind like a forgotten piece of furniture. At first, Max didn't understand what had happened. He waited by the door for days, his tail wagging each time he heard footsteps nearby. But no one came. His food bowl was empty, and the water in his dish froze as the cold crept in. Hunger eventually drove Max out of the backyard and into the streets. The world outside was harsher than anything he had ever known. In the beginning, Max had hope. He wandered the streets, his nose searching for the familiar scents of his owners, believing he might find them again. But as the days turned into weeks, hope turned into despair. The streets of Elmsford were unkind to strays. Max was chased away from storefronts, yelled at by strangers, and once, a boy had thrown a rock at him just for fun. The pain from that rock had lingered for days, but the pain of rejection cut even deeper. As winter set in, Max's body began to deteriorate. Food was scarce, and whatever scraps he managed to find were not enough to sustain him. His fur, once thick and shiny, became matted and began falling out in patches. He grew thinner and weaker with each passing day. The cold gnawed at his bones, and his once warm, brown eyes became dull and lifeless. Still, he kept moving, kept searching, until his body could no longer carry him. Now, he lay in the alley, his breath coming in shallow, uneven puffs. Snowflakes fell gently around him, some settling on his exposed ribs and bare patches of skin. His ears twitched faintly at the sound of footsteps in the distance, but he didn't have the strength to lift his head to see who it was. Not that it mattered, no one ever stopped for him. People walked past him every day, barely sparing him a glance. Some muttered about how the stray population was out of control, while others ignored him entirely. A car passed by on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the alley. Max's body cast a faint shadow on the snow-covered ground. For a moment, it looked as though he was already gone, just another forgotten casualty of a cold, uncaring world. But even in the face of such despair, a tiny flicker of hope remained. Somewhere deep inside him, Max held on. It wasn't a conscious decision. His body was too weak, his spirit too broken for such resolve. But something within him refused to give up entirely. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was the faint memory of a time when he was loved. Whatever it was, it kept him alive, even as the cold tightened its grip. And then, everything changed. The biting wind continued to cut through the quiet streets of Elmsford, but Sarah barely noticed it as she hurried along the icy sidewalk. She had always been a kind soul, with a soft spot for animals, but that night, she was in a hurry. She pulled her coat tighter around her boots crunching against the snow. As she made her way back home after a long day at work, her mind was consumed with thoughts of bills, errands, and everything else she needed to tackle before the week ended. But then something made her stop. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, a shivering figure lying in the shadow of an alley. Sarah blinked, unsure if her eyes were deceiving her. She stepped closer, her breath visible in the freezing air. And that's when she saw him. The dog was lying motionless in the snow, his frail body barely distinguishable from the icy ground around him. His ribs stuck out sharply, his fur was matted and sparse, and his legs were curled tightly against his body, as though he was trying to protect himself from the cold. For a moment, Sarah thought he was already gone. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. She took another step forward, her heart pounding. The dog's eyes flickered open, just barely, and for a brief second, their gazes met. His eyes were hollow, clouded with pain and exhaustion, but there was something else there too, something that made Sarah's heart ache. It was the faintest glimmer of hope, a desperate plea for help. Kneeling in the snow, Sarah reached out slowly, not wanting to frighten him. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice shaking. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog didn't move. He simply lay there, too weak to respond. Sarah's hands hovered over his body for a moment, unsure of where to start. His skin was raw in places where his fur had fallen out, and his body was cold to the touch. She could feel the tremors running through him, his body racked with shivers as the snow continued to fall around them. "Poor thing," she murmured, tears welling up in her eyes. "How long have you been out here?" She looked around, hoping to see someone, anyone, who might have been looking for him. But the streets were empty, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the alley. It was clear that no one had been taking care of this dog for a very long time. Sarah didn't hesitate any longer. She took off her scarf and carefully draped it over the dog's fragile body, trying to give him some warmth. Then she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number for the local animal shelter. "Hi, this is Sarah," she said quickly when the call connected. "I found a dog. He's in really bad shape. I don't think he can make it through the night without help." The voice on the other end of the line was calm but firm. "We're at capacity, ma'am. But if you can bring him to us, we'll do what we can." Sarah bit her lip, glancing down at the dog. He was barely breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven movements. She wasn't sure he could survive the trip to the shelter, but she didn't have any other options. "I'll bring him," she said. "Just, please be ready." Ending the call, Sarah tucked her phone back into her pocket and gently slipped her arms under the dog's frail body. He let out a faint whimper, but he didn't resist. He was too weak to fight her, and Sarah could feel just how fragile he was as she lifted him. It was like holding a feather. His body was so light, so frail, that she couldn't understand how he had managed to survive this long. "It's okay," she whispered as she began walking. "You're safe now. I've got you." The walk to her car felt like an eternity. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind made it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of her. But Sarah didn't stop. She kept moving, her arms cradling the dog close to her chest, her mind racing with worry. When she finally reached her car, she carefully placed the dog on the back seat, wrapping him in a blanket she kept for emergencies. He didn't move, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. Sarah climbed into the driver's seat, her hands shaking as she started the engine. "Hang on, buddy," she murmured, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "We're almost there." As she drove toward the shelter, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that finding this dog wasn't just a coincidence. There was something about him, something that told her he wasn't ready to give up. And as she looked back at him one more time, she made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't let him die alone. Not tonight, not ever. The shelter was quiet when Sarah arrived, the faint hum of heaters the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. As she opened the car door, the bitter wind rushed in, and Sarah winced at the cold. She turned to the back seat where the German Shepherd lay motionless, his fragile body wrapped in a blanket. His breathing was shallow, but it hadn't stopped, and for that, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "Okay, Max," she whispered, giving him a name for the first time. "We're here. You're going to be okay." The name came naturally to her, though she didn't know why. Maybe it was because she couldn't bear the thought of him leaving this world without an identity, without someone acknowledging his worth. Even if he didn't survive, he would be remembered as Max, a fighter. Carefully, Sarah lifted him from the back seat. His body was alarmingly light in her arms, his head resting limply against her shoulder. She kicked the car door shut with her foot and hurried toward the shelter's entrance, her boots crunching against the icy ground. Inside, the warmth of the building enveloped her, but it did little to ease the tension in her chest. The woman at the front desk, a middle-aged volunteer with kind eyes, stood up as soon as she saw them. Her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as she took in the sight of Max. "Oh my," she said, her hand flying to her chest. "He's in bad shape. I found him in an alley," Sarah said quickly, her voice tight with urgency. "He's freezing, starving. He's barely holding on. Please, can you help him?" The woman nodded and motioned for Sarah to follow her. "Bring him back here. We'll do what we can." They moved quickly down a hallway and into a small examination room. The walls were lined with shelves of medical supplies, and a steel table sat in the center under harsh fluorescent lighting. Sarah gently laid Max on the table, her hands trembling as she pulled the blanket away from his body. The volunteer wasted no time, calling for the on-site vet. Within moments, a man in scrubs entered the room, his expression serious as he assessed the situation. He knelt beside Max, his hands moving methodically as he checked the dog's vitals. "He's severely malnourished," the vet muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Dehydrated, hypothermic, but he's still breathing. That's a good sign." Sarah stood to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She felt helpless as she watched the vet work, attaching an IV line to Max's leg to deliver fluids. The dog let out a faint whimper, but didn't resist. "Is he going to make it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The vet glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's too soon to say. He's in critical condition, but he's a fighter. He must be to have survived this long. We'll do everything we can." Sarah nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. She wanted to do more, to somehow take away the pain this dog had endured. But all she could do now was wait and hope. Over the next hour, the vet and his team worked tirelessly. They cleaned Max's wounds, examined his body for any signs of infection, and adjusted the IV drip to provide the nutrients he so desperately needed. Sarah stayed by his side the entire time, her hand resting gently on his head. She whispered words of encouragement, her voice trembling but steady. "You're going to be okay, Max," she said softly. "You're safe now. I promise." Finally, the vet stepped back inside. "He's stable for now," he said, "but it's touch and go. The next 24 hours will be critical." "Can I stay with him?" Sarah asked immediately. The vet hesitated, then nodded. "You can stay. Sometimes having someone close by can make a difference." Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down beside the table. She reached out and stroked Max's fur, her fingers brushing against his exposed ribs. He was so fragile, so broken, but she could see it in his eyes, the faint spark of hope that hadn't gone out completely. The hours dragged on, but Sarah didn't leave his side. She watched as his chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths. She whispered to him about the life he would have, about warm beds and sunny days and never being alone again. She wanted him to hear her, to know that someone cared. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the shelter's windows, Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek. Max's breathing had grown a little stronger, his body a little warmer. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. "We'll get through this together." The following days at the shelter were a whirlwind of emotions for Sarah and Max. Though his condition remained fragile, there were small victories that gave Sarah hope. Max began responding to treatment, his body slowly adjusting to the nutrients and fluids provided by the vet. His breathing grew steadier, and his eyes, once dull and lifeless, began to show faint glimmers of awareness. Sarah had made it her mission to visit him every day, each morning before work and every evening after. She was there by his side. The shelter staff had come to recognize her dedication, and though they admired her commitment, they worried about her growing attachment. They knew how unpredictable cases like Max's could be. But Sarah didn't care. She had made a promise to herself, and to him, that she wasn't going to give up. On her third visit, as Sarah stepped into the small recovery room where Max was being kept, she noticed something different. For the first time, he wasn't lying completely motionless. His head was lifted ever so slightly, and his tired eyes tracked her as she entered the room. "Hey, Max," she said softly, her voice filled with relief. "You're looking better today." She approached him cautiously, as she always did, not wanting to startle him. The last thing she wanted was to trigger any memories of the trauma he had endured. But to her surprise, Max didn't flinch as she reached out her hand. Instead, he sniffed at her fingers, his nose cold and dry but curious. Sarah's heart swelled. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. For days, he had been too weak and too scared to acknowledge her presence. Now, for the first time, he was showing signs of trust. "You're such a brave boy," she whispered, kneeling beside him. Her fingers gently brushed against his fur, careful not to touch the raw patches of skin that still bore the marks of his suffering. "I'm so proud of you." Max closed his eyes, leaning ever so slightly into her touch. It was the first time she had seen him relax, even for a moment. She stayed there with him, speaking softly, telling him stories about her childhood dog, about the warm home she wanted to give him, and about how he would never have to be alone again. As the days turned into a week, Max's progress continued. He began eating small portions of food, his strength returning little by little. The shelter staff marveled at his resilience, though they knew much of it had to do with Sarah's presence. She had become his anchor, the one constant in a world that had been nothing but cruel to him. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when Max's fear would resurface. A sudden noise or a stranger entering the room would cause him to cower, his body trembling as memories of his past overwhelmed him. Sarah hated seeing him like that, but she understood. Healing wasn't linear, and she was determined to be patient with him. One evening, as Sarah sat beside him, Max did something that took her breath away. She had been stroking his fur, her hand moving gently over his side, when he shifted closer to her. Slowly, he placed his head on her lap, letting out a soft sigh. It was a simple act, but to Sarah it felt like a breakthrough. Tears filled her eyes as she looked down at him. "You trust me, don't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I promise I'll never let you down." Max's eyes met hers, and in that moment, she felt an unspoken connection between them. He didn't need to say anything. His trust was clear, and for Sarah, that trust was the greatest gift he could have given her. By the end of the week, the vet gave Sarah some incredible news. Max was strong enough to leave the shelter. His recovery was far from over, but he no longer needed constant medical supervision. He needed a home, a place where he could continue to heal, surrounded by love and care. "I'll take him," Sarah said immediately, her voice firm. "He belongs with me." The vet smiled, handing her a folder of instructions for Max's care. "I had a feeling you'd say that." As Sarah walked out of the shelter that evening, Max by her side, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had saved him from the brink of death, but in many ways, he had saved her too. Together, they were embarking on a new chapter, one filled with challenges, but also with hope. Max's journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. The drive home was quiet, except for the soft hum of the car engine. Max sat in the back seat, bundled in a thick blanket that Sarah had brought for him. His eyes, still tired but more alert than ever, occasionally glanced out the window as the world passed by. Sarah stole a look at him through the rearview mirror and smiled. She couldn't believe how far he had come. Her small house sat on the edge of town, nestled against a grove of trees that provided a serene backdrop even in the middle of winter. Snow lined the driveway as Sarah parked and opened the door for Max. He hesitated, his thin legs shaking slightly as he stepped out onto the icy ground. His paw pads barely touched the snow before he froze, staring up at the house. "It's okay, Max," Sarah said softly, crouching beside him. "This is your home now." Max tilted his head as if trying to understand her words. His body was still frail and his movements slow, but there was something in his eyes, a spark of curiosity, of cautious hope. Sarah held out her hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Max stepped forward. Together, they walked toward the front door. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them. Sarah had spent the past week preparing for Max's arrival, making sure everything was ready. A soft dog bed sat in the corner of the living room, along with a new set of bowls and toys. The fire in the fireplace crackled gently, casting a golden glow across the room. Max's paws slid slightly on the hardwood floor as he entered, his nose twitching as he sniffed the unfamiliar space. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether he truly belonged. Sarah watched him from a distance, giving him space to explore. She knew this transition wouldn't be easy for him. He had spent so long feeling unwanted, unloved. It would take time for him to believe that this home was his. "You take your time," Sarah said softly. "There's no rush." Max wandered into the living room, stopping in front of the dog bed. He sniffed it carefully, then glanced back at Sarah as if asking for permission. She smiled and nodded, her heart swelling with affection. "It's yours, Max," she said. "All of this is yours." Slowly, he lowered himself onto the bed. His movements were stiff, his body still weak, but he let out a soft sigh as he settled in. Sarah knelt beside him, her hand brushing gently over his fur. "You're safe now," she whispered. "You don't have to worry anymore." The next few days were a mix of progress and setbacks. Max adjusted to his new surroundings little by little, though there were moments when his fear would resurface. Loud noises made him flinch, and he often froze at sudden movements, his body tense as if bracing for harm. But Sarah was patient. She never raised her voice, never pushed him too far. Instead, she showered him with quiet affection, letting him come to her on his own terms. Each morning, Sarah would take Max outside for short walks. The cold air seemed to invigorate him, though his legs were still weak and his pace slow. She kept him close, always speaking to him softly, reassuring him that he was safe. One morning, as they walked through the grove of trees behind the house, Max surprised her. He stopped suddenly, his ears perking up as he caught sight of a squirrel darting through the snow. For a moment, he seemed like a completely different dog. His tail gave a small wag, and his body tensed, not with fear, but with excitement. "Max," Sarah said with a laugh, watching as he took a few hesitant steps toward the squirrel before stopping to look back at her. "You're finally starting to feel like yourself again, huh?" It was a small moment, but it filled Sarah with hope. Max was beginning to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. He was learning to trust, to feel safe, to enjoy the world around him again. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Max did something he had never done before. He rested his head on Sarah's lap, letting out a deep, contented sigh. Sarah froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the gesture. Then she smiled, her fingers gently stroking his fur. "You're my brave boy," she whispered, "and I'm so proud of you." Max closed his eyes, his body completely relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. He didn't need words to show his gratitude. It was written in every soft wag of his tail, every glance he gave her. For Sarah, this was the start of something beautiful. Max wasn't just a dog, he was her family, and together they were building a life filled with love and second chances. Though Max had made incredible progress in his new home, there were still moments when his past came rushing back like a dark shadow, threatening to undo all the healing he and Sarah had worked so hard to achieve. It was during these moments that Sarah realized just how deeply Max's scars ran, not just on his body, but on his soul. One evening, as a storm rolled in, Sarah and Max sat by the fire. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and causing the trees to groan under the weight of the freezing rain. Max lay curled up on his bed, his head resting on his paws, seemingly at ease. But when a sudden crack of thunder split the air, his entire body tensed, his ears flattened against his head, and he bolted upright, his eyes wide with fear. "Max, it's okay," Sarah said gently, rising from her chair and kneeling beside him. But he didn't seem to hear her. His breathing became rapid, and his body trembled as if he were back on the streets, facing the harsh winter all over again. Sarah reached out slowly, her hand brushing against his fur. "You're safe," she whispered. "It's just a storm. I'm here. You're not alone." Max's eyes darted around the room, his panic clear. For a moment, Sarah feared he would retreat completely, shutting her out as he had in the early days. But then, something remarkable happened. Max turned his gaze to her, his wide eyes locking with hers. Slowly, tentatively, he stepped closer, pressing his head against her chest. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as his trembling began to subside. "That's it, buddy," she murmured. "I've got you." It was a breakthrough, a sign that Max was beginning to trust her on a deeper level, but it also reminded Sarah of the long road ahead. Healing wasn't a straight path, and Max's past would always be a part of him. All she could do was be there for him, every step of the way. Over the next few days, Sarah worked on helping Max feel more secure. She left a radio on when she went out, its soft music filling the house with a comforting presence. She made a point to sit with him during storms, her calm energy helping him weather the fear, and she introduced him to new experiences gradually, always ensuring that he felt safe and supported. One afternoon, Sarah decided to take Max to the park. It was a quiet, snowy day, and the paths were nearly empty. She wanted him to experience the world beyond the walls of her home, to learn that it wasn't always a place of fear and pain. As they walked along the path, Max stayed close to her side, his leash loose in her hand. He sniffed at the snow, his tail wagging faintly as he explored the unfamiliar scents. For the first time, Sarah saw a glimpse of the dog he was meant to be, a dog full of curiosity and life. But as they rounded a corner, a jogger came running toward them, his footsteps crunching loudly on the frozen path. Max froze, his body stiffening as his ears flattened against his head. Sarah felt the tension in the leash and immediately knelt beside him. "It's okay, Max," she said softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. "He's not going to hurt you." The jogger slowed, noticing Max's fear, and gave them a wide berth. Sarah waited until he had passed before gently stroking Max's fur. "You're okay," she said. "You're safe." Max looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But then, slowly, he relaxed. His tail gave a small wag, and Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You're so brave," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I knew you could do it." By the time they returned home, Max seemed calmer, more at ease. He curled up on his bed by the fire, his body stretched out in a way that showed he was finally beginning to feel comfortable in his own skin. Sarah sat nearby, watching him with a smile. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said softly. Max glanced up at her, his eyes warm and trusting. In that moment, Sarah knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Max's journey wasn't over, but he had taken another step forward, and for Sarah, that was all that mattered. Winter slowly began to loosen its icy grip on the small town of Elmsford. The snowbanks that had once lined the streets melted into streams, and the first signs of spring appeared in the form of tiny buds on the trees. For Max, it wasn't just a change of seasons. It was the start of a new life. Sarah had made it her mission to ensure that Max never had to feel alone or unwanted again. Every morning, they went on walks through the forested paths near her home. The once fragile dog, who had been too weak to stand now, trotted confidently beside her, his tail wagging with each step. His fur, though still thin in some places, had grown back in patches of healthy, soft brown. His eyes, no longer clouded with fear, sparkled with curiosity and warmth. It had been months since Sarah had first found Max in that snowy alley. She often thought back to that night. The image of his frail body lying in the snow burned into her memory. She could hardly believe that the dog walking beside her now was the same one she had cradled in her arms, fearing he wouldn't make it through the night. One sunny afternoon, as they walked through the park, Sarah decided to let Max off his leash for the first time. It was a moment she had been working toward, knowing that trust and freedom went hand in hand. She knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his collar. "Max," she said softly, looking into his eyes, "I think you're ready for this." His ears perked up as if he understood her words. She unhooked the leash, and for a moment he stood still, his body tense as he glanced around. Then, as if realizing he was truly free, Max took off. He ran across the open field, his paws kicking up small clouds of dirt and grass. Sarah watched with a smile, her heart swelling with pride. Max ran in wide circles, his movements full of energy and joy. He stopped occasionally to sniff at flowers or chase a butterfly, and each time he turned back to Sarah, as if checking to make sure she was still there. She waved at him, laughing as he bounded back toward her, his tail wagging furiously. "You're amazing, Max," she said when he reached her, kneeling down to hug him. "I'm so proud of you." The bond they had built over the months was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Max wasn't just a pet, he was family. He had taught her about resilience, about the power of love and patience, and about how second chances could change everything. Back at home that evening, Sarah sat by the fire, Max curled up at her feet. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting to the future. She knew that their journey wasn't over. Max still had moments of fear, times when his past crept back into his mind. But those moments were fewer now, and each day he grew stronger, more confident, and more at peace. As the fire crackled softly, Max let out a contented sigh, shifting slightly to rest his head on Sarah's foot. She smiled down at him, her heart full. "You saved me just as much as I saved you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the warmth of the room. "I'll never let you go, Max. You're home now." Max's eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at her with an expression of pure trust. In that moment, Sarah knew that their story, though full of hardships, was one of triumph. Together, they had faced the shadows of the past and come out stronger on the other side. The world outside might still hold its challenges, but as long as they had each other, they could face anything. Max was no longer the broken dog she had found in the snow. He was a survivor, a fighter, and, most importantly, her companion. And as they sat there, wrapped in the warmth of their home, it was clear this was just the beginning of a beautiful new chapter for both of them. Max's journey from the brink of death to finding love and safety reminds us all of the power of second chances. His story is proof that compassion and patience can transform even the most broken souls into survivors. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves inspiring tales of hope and resilience. Together, we can spread the message that every life matters.